Let me get you guys a game pin. Or a QR code. I guess that's what we're doing now, QR codes. So there's our QR code for this Kahoot. If you're on the app or the website, then you have the game pin there. 245-6379. Are you guys you guys aren't all doing these? Kahoot's assigning them to you. They keep things fun, don't they? Good morning.
If you're logged in on the app too and you click on it, you can change your little character picture.
You can, so you can fix your little avatar. Fun. Good morning. Some of these seem fitting, like Jeff, for example. Did you pick the rainbow unicorn? I love it. That's great.
It definitely fits, though.
I love these. Let's see. Bill's got some shades. Pinky. They almost made you pink. A little football helmet. Alondra, it's got a brain with a crown on it. This is fun. That's what I like about Kahoot. You never know what it's going to look like each time you log on. Few more seconds to get in if you want to play. If you don't want a Kahoot on your phone, I do think that you want to play along in your mind. This Kahoot is on units 14, 15, and 21. So this is our financing Kahoot and our, good morning, and our unit 21 is basically going to closing. So there's a couple questions from there as well. Good morning. Everybody on that wants to play? Y'all ready, Kahoot? All right, let's see what we got. 14, 15, and 21. Question number 1. A mortgage loan can have its lien priority lowered through the use of a eight seconds. Mortgage loan can have its lien priority lowered through the use of a subordination agreement. Remember, if you subordinate, you agree to put yourself in a lower ranking. So where and when we talked about this, remember we said your senior mortgage is the first loan that you take, the loan that you got to buy the home. Any mortgage you take after that is a junior mortgage. Junior mortgage is recorded after the senior, so the junior knows that they're going to get paid. Lien priority. In the event that you want to refinance your senior mortgage, the senior is not going to agree to refinance, and they're not going to agree to be paid under your junior mortgage. So if the senior mortgage is going to agree to do a refinance, the junior mortgage has to agree to subordinate. The junior mortgage has to agree to still be paid after the senior. That's the only way your senior mortgage is going to agree to do a refinance. They were the first guys there. They always expect to be paid first. And that's what we mean by this subordination agreement. Do I have any questions on this? So let's see. Who got it right the fastest this morning? Who's the quickest? Bill's the fastest, followed by Lee and Abby, JJ, and Pinky. Question number 2. The right a borrower has to regain property ownership by paying debt after foreclosure sale is called. Ten seconds. Good job, guys. If you are regaining the property, if you're getting the property, if you're saving yourself from foreclosure, you are redeeming yourself. Anytime you're redeeming yourself, you're saving yourself. North Carolina, we use what's called the equity redemption, which says you have the opportunity to save yourself, to redeem yourself after the foreclosure sale. Show me on your hands, how many people remember how many days after the foreclosure sale you have to redeem yourselves from foreclosure? Yep, 10. So 10 days in North Carolina after the foreclosure sale, you can redeem yourself. If you're redeeming yourself, you're just saving yourself. You're preventing yourself from getting into foreclosure. Questions on this one? So now we got JJ climbed up, Abby, Bill's still on, and Pinky. Nicolette came up. Question number 3. The main purpose of a mortgage is to Seven seconds. The main purpose. Are there other purposes of the mortgage? Sure. What's the main purpose? To provide security for the loan. This is what the lender has. This is the collateral that the lender has in the event that you stop making your payments. So they have the mortgage. You give the lender the mortgage when you take this loan. It does create a lien on the property. It does. But it's not the main purpose. The main thing that it does is it offers security to the lender. I like this question because this reminds us that when you guys are doing practice questions and your exam questions, we're looking for the best answer. Does that mean you could have another good answer? Sure, but we're looking for the best one. Questions on this one? Now we got Nicolette flew up to the top, Lee's up, Abby's still on, Bill, JJ. Alondra is up, our highest climber this round. She's up 8 places. Question number 4, Fannie Mae. Five seconds. Fannie Mae is a player on the secondary market. What do players on the secondary market do? They purchase loans, they buy loans from the primary market. The primary is who you and I talk to. When you want to borrow money, you go talk to somebody in the primary market. Once they originate your loan, they may service your loan. When we say they service your loan, we're saying that they're buying your loan. Remember, Fannie Mae's the biggest. She's the hungriest. She'll buy them all. Conventional, FHA, VA, USDA. She doesn't care. She will buy them all. And she buys them from the set or the primary mortgage. Questions on this one? Good morning. All right, so we got Nicolette staying on, Abby staying on, Lee's here, Bill and Andrew. 5 of you are on fire. If you look at your phone, I bet you see a little fireball, so you know who you are. I don't know who you are, but you know who you are. Question number 5. A mortgage loan that is secured by both real and personal property is called? 5 seconds. Is our package mortgage. Yep. So the package mortgage combines. You're buying the real property and you're buying the personal property. The example we gave of this is all that lovely wicker furniture when you buy that condo at the beach. It's not uncommon to buy a beach condo furnished. So when you do that, you would use a package mortgage. A blanket mortgage is a mortgage that covers more than one parcel of land. So let's say, for example, you're a developer and you want to buy 5 parcels of land. So you can clear the land, subdivide them, and create a development. You would buy those 5 parcels of land using a blanket mortgage. You're buying more than one piece of land. Questions on this one? This is a good Kahoot. Now we got, that didn't budge much, did it? Nicolette, Lee, and Abby, Bill and Andrew, 3 of you are on fire. You should have little fireballs. Question number 6. At settlement, commission generally appears as a? Ten seconds. Commission is a debit to the seller. The seller pays what? CDE. Commission, deed preparation fee, and excise tax. Questions on this one? Nicolette and Lee, Bill, JJ crept up, Andrew. 3 of you lost. Oh no, that's not good, Kahoot. Tough round, it says. 3 of you lost your answer sheet. That's all right. Let's get it back on this last one. Last one. Which of the following items is not usually prorated between buyer and seller at settlement? Eight seconds. Good one. Yep. We do not split recording fees. What do we share? What do we prorate? This year's property taxes, HOA dues if applicable, and rent if applicable. Questions on this one? Good Kahoot, you guys. Financing Kahoot's usually rough. You guys did good. Okay. Big reveal. Here we go. Third place Kahooter is Bill with his little back glasses. Our second place is Lee. And our first place is Nicolette. Runners up, I got fourth and fifth place, JJ and Andrew. Good job, everybody. Questions? Good. Good, good. Kahoot's fun, isn't it? And I hope it's helpful as well. Questions? Anybody, anything? Okay.
I have a question real quick.
Yes, please.
Is Kahoot only available through you? Or,
Unfortunately, through my account, yes. But
Okay.
remember, we're recording.
right, okay,
So if you go to Kahoot and just start searching for real estate questions, you'll find stuff. But guys, I don't know who created it. I don't know what state they're in. There's a lot of unknown variables in there.
okay.
So if you're going to go back in Kahoot, I would suggest going back through our recording because I validated those questions. Just a couple reminders. 2 weeks. Reminder number 1, 2 weeks. Your final exam is the 17th. It's online. The last thing we will do on the 15th is talk about my exam, the rules and expectations, make sure we're all on the same page for test day. If you do not pass on the 17th, but you make at least a 50%, you are eligible for the retake. The retake is scheduled for Monday, November 21st. It is also online. We will be in touch after the exam on the 17th with instructions on that. Who's going to provide it, Zoom link, that good stuff, but we're not going to do it until we know. I do suggest you guys go ahead and pencil this date in, the 21st. Maybe you need it, maybe you don't. That's why I say pencil, that in the event you need it, this opportunity is here. I think this is good. I think the retake is good. And guys, I'm here to tell you, not all schools offer a retake. So I think giving you a second chance, I know there's a lot of things that may come up on the 17th. So I think give you a second chance is beneficial. We also got a couple cram courses coming up next week. Jane's doing your guys's on Friday the 11th. Lane will send you the email with Jane's Zoom link that week, either Wednesday or Thursday that week. So you can be on the lookout for an email from Lane. And then I'm also doing one for another class on November 12th that we decided to open up to you guys. So you're welcome to come on the 12th if you want to come to mine. You have my Zoom link, same link we use to access class. You can come to both, you can come to neither, you can come to one. It's entirely up to you. You cannot use this to make up class time. This is not a real estate commission course. This is just something that Carolina School of Real Estate offers you guys to help get you ready for the test. Questions on the cram courses or the retake?
I have a question. So on the tests for both of those, are we concentrating on the whole shebang? Or are we concentrating on state and then national, like with you on the 11th and the 12th?
I don't know what Jane covers, right? But for mine, my big focus is state specific stuff.
Cool. Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. I think that's Jane's main focus, but I don't know. Please don't hold me to that. I don't know for sure. I do spend just a little bit of time in math, like the last 30 minutes, kind of reintroducing the T-bar 101 kind of thing. But yeah, my main focus for my cram course is the state specific material. Other questions? Okay. All right. Appraiser's hat back on. Let's get back into unit 17. And we need to go back for just a minute in unit 17. I know we left talking about the cost approach, and we'll pick back up there in just a second. But before we do that, we need to go back and review the sales comparison approach. And we need to look at, I call it a math problem. It's not really a math problem, but it's the math that you see with the sales comparison approach. The reason I guess I call it a math is because there's numbers on it. But what we're looking at here, you may see a problem looks similar to this. You got your subject properties, 3-bedroom, 2-bath. It has a fireplace. We've studied the subject and we've learned about it. And then the appraiser went out and they found a comp. Actually, they found 2 comps. And then the problem will have to give you the value. So it tells you what a bedroom goes for. It tells you a bathroom. It tells you a fireplace. Guys, please remember, we cannot determine value. If you want to learn how to determine value, you need to go to appraiser school. So for your exams, they will have to tell you what a bedroom is worth. They will have to tell you the various values. When you guys see these on your exam, please go to your book and flip with me to page 446. We looked at the sales comparison approach on page 446. And when you guys do these, when you come across these problems on your exam, I suggest setting yourself up on your scratch paper, very similar to something that you see on page 446. So we're going to go through and we're going to first study the subject property. And then we're going to do a nice side-by-side comparison of the comps. So the subject property tells us it's a 3-bed, 2-bath, and it has a fireplace. So we're setting ourselves up nice, neat rows and columns. I think the rows and columns is easier to see than looking at the problem on the PowerPoint or your test. So we've studied our subject, and now we're going to go and study our comps. So comp 1 has 3 bedrooms. It has 1 bath. And it does not have a fireplace. It recently sold for $118,000. What that tells me is recently a buyer was willing to pay $118,000 for that property. And then we're going to study comp 2. Comp 2 is a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, and it has a fireplace. And it recently sold for 126. So all we've done so far is taken the information from the problem and put it into something that we can see, something that can make sense, nice, neat rows and columns. So now what we need to do is study each comp as it relates to the subject. Remember, never, ever, ever adjust the subject. And this is where our hand trick that we learned last class comes into play. So we're going to study comp 1 together, and then I'm going to let you guys study comp 2, and then we'll come back and compare our results. So let's study comp 1 together as it relates to the subject. My subject has 3 bedrooms. Comp 1 has 3 bedrooms. Do I need to make any adjustments to the bedrooms in comp 1? Do we need to do anything? Nope, they're pretty equal, aren't they? Subject has 3, comp 1 has 3. My subject has 2 bedrooms, comp 1 has 1. What do I need to do to comp 1 to make it match my subject?
Add 4,500.
I need to add. My right hand is down, so I need to add. That's right. And the problem tells me that the value of a bathroom is $4,000. So to the price that a buyer was willing to pay to that, we're going to add $4,000 for a bedroom. My subject has a fireplace, comp 1 does not. Again, what do we need to do? We need to add. We seeing the hand trick? Are we seeing how this is helpful? So we know that it is an inferior thing, which means to make it match the subject, we need to add $2,000. So now, after studying the comp as it relates to the subject, I can take the sales price and I can adjust it by adding $6,000. So now for comp one, I have an adjusted value of $124,000. This is comp one as it relates to the subject. Questions on comp one? Okay. All right, you guys do comp two. Compare comp two to the subject. Tell me in a private chat what the adjusted price for comp two is. Comp two as it relates to the subject. I'll answer that in just 1 second. Okay. So while you guys are finishing up comp two, and I'm getting a couple questions on comp one. So one of the questions I have, why aren't we deducting for a fireplace? Why aren't we deducting for a bathroom? We need to add to the comp to make it match the subject. So my left hand is my subject property and it has 2 bathrooms. My right hand is my comp. It is less than, 2 is less than 1. So because it is less than, to make it match my subject, I need to add. Same thing with the fireplace. My subject property has 1 fireplace, my comp does not. So in order to adjust it and make it match, I need to add. I don't have a third comp in this problem. And guys, you know, to be fair, this is just for teaching us how to do this. But if we were actually doing a sales comparison approach, the appraiser would look at least 3 comps, 3 to 4 comps. I see what you're saying. Be careful about doing that because there's several differences between the comps. I'll go back and address that in just a second. So now let's look at comp 2 as it relates to the subject. My subject has 3 bedrooms. Comp 2 has 4. What do I need to do to make comp 2 bedroom match my subject? I need to deduct. It has something superior than the subject. So to make it match, I need to deduct. So we're going to come into comp 2 and deduct the value of a bathroom, which is $4,500. Subject has 2, comp 2 has 2. Subject has a fireplace, comp 2 has a fireplace. So no other adjustments to make. So now we can say, studying comp 2 as it relates to the subject, my adjusted value is $121,500. The appraiser would put, using these adjusted values, the appraiser would put a value on this. They would determine, it looks to me like comp 2 is more similar to the subject because we made fewer adjustments. So the appraiser would probably put a little bit more weight on comp 2 than they do on comp 1. Does that make sense? They're going to say, well, because United made fewer adjustments, it's closer to the subject. They never use an average. They're not going to add them up and divide by 2. They're going to put more weight on the comp that is most likely to the subject. If you and I were doing this, we would report it in a range. So I would look at my seller and I would say, based on my CMA, your probable sales price is going to be between 121,500 and 124,000. Let's list it for something more than that. Remember, when we say probable sales price, what we're predicting is what it's going to sell for. So we do usually want to list it a little bit more. And there's a lot of other factors involved. You know, what's the condition of the subject as it compares to the comps? Does it need updates? You know, all sorts of things to look at here. So we just comp 1 and 2 with the subject. Yeah, we do not compare comp to comp. Remember, the subject is the property that we're studying. This is the property that we care about. So we study the comps as they relate to the subject. So yeah, I mean, you know, and it depends on the market, right? If I'm telling you this is your range for probable sales price, you know, a year ago, I'd say, shoot, let's list it for 150,000, right? Because that was the market that we were in. 5 years ago, I'd probably say, let's put it on for 127. So you want to make sure when you list it, you want to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room for negotiations. The question I had just come in, comparing comps to comps, this is what we looked at the other day. And the only reason why we could compare comp to comp is because there's only one difference. The houses are identical except for the number of bedrooms. Once you have different differences, like bedroom, bath, and fireplace, I doubt you will see this. Probably what you're going to see is where they give you the values. Never, ever, ever. Boy, I can't get more absolute than that, can I? Never, ever, ever adjust the subject. Never, ever. You always adjust the comps to match the subject. Questions? I do have, I do want to point this out real quick before I forget. In Learn Test Pass, under the Unit 17 material, I have a sales comparison approach worksheet. And I think this is good in helping you guys studying comps. Not all comps are good comps. Some comps are going to be better than others. So what the appraiser needs to do is start with studying the subject property, which we can see here that our subject property is 231 Thomas Drive, and it gives us the information that we need about the subject. This appraiser went out and found 7 comps. That doesn't mean all 7 comps are good comps. So once they find these comps, then they need to determine which ones are best. And this is why the appraiser's opinion is just that. You may find 3 comps, I may find 3 different comps. So there is no exact science to do this. And this is why it's everybody's opinion. This is why you could have 2 different appraisals with 2 different opinions. So I think for you guys to kind of go through and study the comps, and you can use that same, you know, line it up, subject property, comp 1, comp 2, comp 3. For example, comp 2, I just want to point this out, tells us is located a few blocks away and is under contract. We know the list price, but when properties are under contract, we don't know the contract price. We do not disclose the contract price. We don't disclose the price until it closes. There's a couple reasons for that. First off, the price can change. Couldn't buyer and seller come back and renegotiate the contract price? Yeah, anything's negotiable, right? So we could always come back and renegotiate. I think the other big reason why we do not disclose the contract price, put yourself in the seller's shoes. If this contract terminates, now every buyer going forward knows what you were willing to accept. So to help protect the seller, we don't disclose the contract price. We don't disclose the price until it closes. But what we can do, what we do know, if we were talking to sellers and we were studying a CMA, what we can say is at this list price of $275,000, a buyer and seller were able to go under contract. Is it overpriced? Is it underpriced? Is the sales price around that? I have no idea. But at this asking price of 275, buyer and seller were able to work it out. So my point of saying all that is that when we're studying comps, remember what we're looking for is closed prices. We want to know what a buyer was actually willing to pay for that. Gives you the facts. It tells you the value of everything. Again, we're not expected to know that. So it does give you the facts. And then it says using the above information, find 3 good comps to determine a range for the probable sales price for the subject property. So I think this is a good worksheet for you guys to kind of go through and think about which comps are better than others. I have put my opinion in here. Your opinion may differ than mine. This isn't a matter of right or wrong. This is just what I think. So you have something to compare. And of course, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. That's a great point. Somebody says, even though it's an opinion, the loan amount is contingent on the appraisal. Well, first off, we have no contingency. So let's make sure we're using that word very carefully. The lender will issue the loan based on value, loan to value ratio. The lender defines value as the purchase price or the appraised amount, whichever one is less. So the lender does require the appraiser, even though it's an opinion, the lender does require that to know which one, the sales price or the appraised amount, to issue the loan on. The lender requires the appraisal. If your buyer's getting a loan, a lender's required, period, end of story. If it's a cash buyer, the appraisal is recommended, but they don't have to do it if they're a cash buyer. If your cash buyer starts asking a lot of questions about value, I would suggest that they have an appraisal done so they know. That's a great question. Can you request a second opinion if they appraise it for less? Sure. I mean, we can always ask. Some lenders may allow you to order a second appraisal. Some may not. Some loan types, there's no definite answer to that. I have heard of cases where appraisals come in low and the buyers fight it, and the lender does order another appraisal. The buyer still gets to pay for both. But guys, from my experience, for the most part, the lender says, this is the appraisal, this is what we're going by. This is very subjective. Yes. Will the test be more specific on which comps to use or which valuables? So remember the things that we're going to study. Let's go back to page 444. The comps that we're looking for, we want something that closed recently. So if something, for example, closed 2 years ago, that's not going to be a good comp. So they may throw something like that in on your exam. Location, we want something close by. Maybe in the same neighborhood, the same subdivision. If you're out rural, you may have to go out like half a mile radius or a mile radius. When we're doing CMAs, I mean, I can't speak for appraisers, but when we're doing CMAs, I tend to start small and work out as I need to. So generally when I'm doing a CMA, I'll start with like a quarter mile radius and see what I got. And if I don't have enough comps, then maybe I go out to half a mile, right? So you start small, quarter mile, everything that closed in the last 6 months. If I can't find enough comps to use, then we have to start adjusting and going out. Physical features of the property. What is it we want to compare? Number of bedrooms, square footage, what lot size. for examples. Again, that is very subjective. And then the terms and conditions of the sale. So that's what we mean by some comps are better than other. I mean, some appraisers are better than others, right? So this might be how they learn how to do this in appraisal school. And guys, I'm telling you, this is one of these things. It takes training and it just takes experience. So once you get with your firm, you'll definitely get some more training on how to do CMAs. And the more you do, the better you'll understand. But always, refer to your BIC or a seasoned agent if you're not sure. Is any of this public, like from the previous sale? Good question. So MLSs keep all their listings. Triad MLS came to be, I think, in like 1997. Every listing that's ever been in the Triad MLS is available for us to view. So you can always go back. Pictures help. You can study pictures from the comps and see how they relate to the subject. So no, the public may not have access to this, but you and I do in MLS. Or you will in MLS. Sales comparison approach. We're studying the subject. We're adjusting the comps to match the subject. Questions? There you go. The 4 C's: closed, close by, call outs, and conditions. There you go. 4 C's. I just learned something today too. Closed, recently, close by, call outs such as your physical features, and conditions of the sale. Will we have that sheet available, or is it something we have to set up when we see this problem? You have scratch paper. Yep, you have scratch paper. Both My Exam and PSI. Where do you get cost per square foot? You take the cost. So in like the example here of comp number 1, cost per square foot, the cost of the property divided by the square foot, cost per square foot. So how much is each square foot in this property? $104.76. Cost divided by square foot. That's the square foot method. Cost per square foot. Okay. Where we left off the other day, we were talking about the cost approach. The cost approach is the second approach of value that the appraiser can take. And remember what the cost approach does. The appraiser will put value on the land. They determine the value of the land as if it were vacant. So let's pretend that there's no structure on this land. What is this land worth? That's one piece of the cost approach. The second piece of the cost approach is putting value on the structure. So the appraiser will actually study both separately. What is the land worth as if it was vacant? What is the structure cost? The appraiser will look at the replacement cost or the reproduction cost that we talked about back on page 447. Reproduction cost and replacement cost. The appraiser, when appraising the structure, also has to consider depreciation. Structures depreciate. Depreciation is just the loss of value for any reason. So structures depreciate. We talked about our physical deterioration can be curable, it can be incurable. We talked about our functional obsolescence can be curable or incurable. And then we last left talking about our economic obsoletes, which is always incurable. These are surrounding factors, surrounding forces that there's nothing that we can do about. Talking just a little bit more about putting value on the structure and depreciation. The appraiser may look at the age life method. This looks at the effective age of the building. The effective age, think of the effective age of its useful life. How long do we expect this building to be useful? Is it 30 years? Is it 50 years? And then the appraiser may actually consider the economic life, which is the number of years left of the effective age. So again, the appraiser is just studying the structure, putting value on it. And one common way to use this effective age and this economic life, when we're talking about depreciation, a very common method is the straight line method. And what the straight line method says is that the building, the structure depreciates evenly over its useful life. So let's say, for example, and accountants use this tool as well. So let's say, for example, we determine that the actual life, the useful life is 50 years. I'm not saying this building is going to fall down on year 51. What I'm saying is after 50 years, it starts losing, it's lost that value. It's depreciated down to its original cost. And what the straight line method says is that it's going to depreciate evenly over its useful life. So let's say, for example, this building is valued at $500,000. The value is $500,000. And we determine it has an effective life of 50 years. What we're saying is that every year this building is going to depreciate $10,000. So year one, it's going to lose $10,000, year 5, year 15, year 37, year 49. Every year, that's what the straight line method says. Every year it depreciates $10,000. So how can you determine how much you have left, how much effective life or actual life you have left? Again, the straight line method seems to be the easiest, simplest, I should say. $50 is the number of years. Yep. The effective age. My made up example. So this is what we just did. We had the structure and land. The appraiser separates the two. They put the value on the structure as if it were just like hanging out there, no land, just the structure, just the improvement. It's going to account for depreciation. How much have we lost? How much do we have left? What year in that 50 years are we in? The appraiser is going to put a value on the land as if it were vacant. And then they're going to bring them back together to give us the cost approach for both. Look with me, if you will, to page 448 in your book, 448. And we can see on page 448, we're once again studying 155 Potter Drive. This appraiser used the square foot method to put the value on the land. So it's 60 by 130. Length times width will tell you the square feet. They figure $450 per front foot. So 450 times 60 gives us a land value of $27,000. They're going to add some site improvements. So the driveway, landscaping, etc. So this appraiser put a total value on the land of $35,000. If we were to sell this land vacant, the appraiser thinks we can sell the land for $35,000. Then we go and study the structure. So there's our building valuation. Again, they use the square foot method. Our 1,500 square feet is $65 per square feet. This is a cost of the structure. And then we have to deduct from depreciation. So there's your curable physical depreciation. There's a functional obsoletes. There's no external, no environmental. So we deducted depreciation, and now we have a depreciated value of the building of $81,750. The appraiser determined that the land is worth $35,000. The structure is worth $81,750. So what's the value of both combined? In this case, $116,750. They studied both of them separately. Cost approach is the best method for the appraiser to use for special use properties. Churches, schools. And of particular importance, of particular note, new construction. If you have a brand new subdivision, the first unit, the first couple units, we may have to use the cost approach. Please remember what we said. There's 3 approaches to value. We're going to talk about the third one after break. There's 3 approaches to value that the appraiser can take, and they're going to use as many of the 3 as they can to help arrive at their opinion. They can almost always use the cost approach. Questions on the cost approach? Okay. So let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the third approach of value that appraisers use. we back? Welcome back. All right, so I'm going to take attendance. And we're going to talk about the third approach to determining value that the appraiser can take. So again, let's put our appraiser cap back on. We're thinking like an appraiser. So we talked about the sales comparison approach, which the appraiser determines is the best for resale properties and vacant land. Then we talked about the cost approach, which is the best approach for putting value on special use properties, churches, schools, libraries, hospitals, and new construction. The third approach that the appraiser may use is called the income capitalization approach. And the theory behind the income capitalization approach says that the value of a building can be determined on how much income it produces. So the income capitalization approach is best for rental properties. Think of a large apartment complex, a retail store, an office park, any type of property that produces an income. The income approach studies how much income we're collecting, the expenses, for example, of the building, and how much income it produces. And again, based on that, we can arrive at value. So it looks at the present worth to the future income. How much do we expect to collect? And one thing that the appraiser studies, as do investors, we're going to just touch on investors right now. We will talk a little bit more about investors in Unit 12. But one thing that they both, investors and appraisers, care about when studying their income is their net operating income. Net operating income helps determine the profitability of these income producing properties. How profitable is it? What is your net operating income? Investors may also study the capitalization rate. The capitalization rate is the investor's rate of return. Rate of return just says, when am I going to get my money back? If I invest in this investment property, what is my rate of return? What is my capitalization rate? How long is it going to take me to get my money back? Capitalization rates tend to be, subjective depending on the investor. In general, the higher the capitalization rate, the higher the risk, because the higher the capitalization rate, the longer it's going to take you to get your money back. But each investor may study this differently. Let's say you're a brand new investor and you're just getting started in the investment business, and you only have one investment property. All your eggs are literally in one basket, aren't they? And if that property is vacant, if that tenant doesn't pay rent, then you have nothing. But what if you're an investor with 20 investment properties? You have a little bit more room for risk, right? Because if one tenant doesn't pay, you're still collecting rent from 19 others that you can use to help. So capitalization rate, again, the higher the rate, the longer it's going to take you to get your return. But for the investor, it comes down to how many of these do I have? The more you have, the less risk each individual one is. When it comes to the math, a little bit of math for doing the income capitalization approach, there is a formula that we just have to know. I'll give you guys just a minute to write this down, and then we're going to talk about it. So this is the formula to find the net operating income. And in just a second, we're going to take the net operating income and we're going to take it a step further. But for right now, let's talk about how we arrive at the net operating income. Potential gross income, also known as the PGI. Let's call the PGI the dream. If you were collecting 100% rent 100% of the time, what's the maximum you can make on this investment property? All your tenants pay on time every time. So if you're collecting rent every month for 12 months a year, what's the max? That's your PGI. We're going to call that the dream. By the way, before I forget, this formula is always calculated annually. Write that down, annually. So when they give you monthly rent, what do? Times it by 12, okay? So we first arrive at what's the most, what's my potential? What's the max I can collect on this investment property? The dream. From the PGI, we deduct vacancy and collection losses. Maybe we have a squatter tenant that won't leave and we got to take them to court. We're going to talk about squatters and landlords and tenants and all that good stuff in Unit 11. So we're getting there. So from our PGI, we deduct vacancy and collection losses. And that gives us our effective gross income, also known as our EGI. PGI is the dream. EGI is the reality. PGI says I'm collecting rent every month this year. EGI says this is how much I'm actually collecting. Even your best tenant may move out and you may have a month where you're not collecting rent because you're getting the unit ready for the next tenant. From our effective gross income, cool, we're going to deduct our operating expenses. Operating expenses are things like janitorial fees, maintenance fees, management fees, administration fees, insurance, taxes, all the things you need to operate your business. Operating expenses for our purposes are going to pretty much be everything except for depreciation. Depreciation does not belong in operating expenses. And the other thing where your practice problems like to trick you, the other thing not included in operating expenses is your debt service. What's your debt service? Why don't you guys remind me in the chat? What is your debt service? Your debt service is what you owe the bank. It's your principal and your interest. Debt service does not go in operating expenses. We will talk in Unit 12 about what to do with debt services. So we're actually going to see this formula again. I got this formula in 2 different units in this book. What does that tell you about this formula? Kind of sort of important, right? Memorize it, you guys. Get it on a flashcard. You've got to know this formula to work these problems. So once we deduct our operating expenses, now we come to our net operating income. Now that we know the net operating income, shoo, here's the good news. We can use a T-bar. Once we find the net operating income, we can use that to help us determine either the capitalization rate or the value. Here's the deal. Your test is going to ask you for the value or the capitalization rate. And it's going to give you the information you need to find your net operating income. So it's going to give you the PGI. It's going to give you the operating expenses. It's going to give you vacancy. It's not going to give you the net operating income. So it's going to ask you for value or cap rate. I'll ask you for one and give you the other. This is one of these fun two-step problems. First, you got to find the net operating income. Then you'll be asked to solve for value or the capitalization rate. Again, I can't stress the importance of memorizing this formula. If you don't know the formula, you don't know what to do with the numbers. If you don't know what to do with the numbers, you might as well put down C or B or whatever you like and move on, because you got to know the formula. I'm not kidding when I say the formula is like 80% of the battle. So once again, I encourage you, put this thing on a flashcard or put it on your phone or whatever you got to do to get this. And one trick that students in the past have used to help them remember this formula is by remembering a big plate of Oreo cookies. What's this trick, you ask? Students like to remember the order of this formula by thinking poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. I can't make this stuff up. Poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. I don't think Violet's doing too bad if she's eating Oreos any night, but it helps us remember the order. I know, is that about, I'm with you. I wish I could eat Oreos every night, but I'm not Violet. So, so this helps us remember the order. PGI minus vacancy and collection gives us our EGI, minus operating expenses gives us our net operating income. Dang it, do we all want an Oreo now? Everybody have this written down? You got the formulas. First formula to find the net operating income. And then the next formula to find value or the capitalization rate. Anybody not good? Let me say that. Speak now. Okay. So here's a problem. Using your formulas that you have, take just a few minutes. Tell me in a private chat what the capitalization rate is. Remember, if we're looking for a rate, we're looking for a rate or a percent. You got one more minute and then we'll talk about it. Yes, I can. Okay. What do we do when we see a math problem? What do we do? Just read it. Just read it. I know we're excited. We just want to pick the calculator up and do something. Just read the problem. Isn't that good advice for all the problems? Read and breathe and read. All right. Each unit of a fourplex rents for $650 per month. Vacancy losses average 10% per year. Operating expenses are $1,300 per month. Property is valued at $150,000. What is the investor's expected capitalization rate? I generally like to start with where I want to end, which means the first thing I like to do is identify my X. What am I solving for? And in this case, I'm solving for the capitalization rate. And now we go back into the problem and figure out the information I need to find that capitalization rate. The problem tells me my value is 150,000. And the other piece of this T-bar is my net operating income. Do I know my net operating income? Not yet. Do I have the information I need to find my net operating income? So now we're going to put the T-bar aside for a second. And we're going to go to our formula for net operating income. And we start with looking at the PGI. PGI says if I'm collecting rent 100% of the time, 12 months out of the year, what's the max I can make? So this building is a fourplex, which means it has how many units available to rent? How many units do you rent? Yeah, I got 4, don't I? So each unit rents for $650 a month. So 4 times 650 tells me my monthly rent PGI, is 2,600. Then we said that all of these problems are calculated annually. So now that I have my monthly rent for all 4, now I need to times them by 12. So my PGI, how much rent, how much income do I expect to collect on this fourplex this year? What's the max I can make? 31,200. I can't make more than that unless I increase my rent. Everybody with me? This is the max. This is the dream. Questions so far on how I got that 31,200? My PGI. So now that we know the dream, we need to figure out the reality. The dream is to collect $31,200 a year. In reality, I have vacancy losses that average 10%. So from my PGI, I'm going to deduct 10%. So you can either actually deduct the 10%, or if you want to, 31,000 times 10% is $3,000. I should have done it by calculator. So I know 10% is $3,120. So when I deduct that, 3,000, then I get 080. Two different ways to get there. Makes no difference to me how you get there. The dream is to collect 31,200, but in reality, how much am I going to collect this year? $28,080. EGI. Questions? Then we know my operating expenses are 1,300 per month. Again, we're going to solve this annually. So that 1,300 times 12 is going to give me my annual operating expenses. Annual operating expenses, 15,600. So from my EGI, I deduct, 15,600. And that gives me a net operating income of 12,480. So we took our PGI, we deducted our vacancy and collection losses to get our EGI. We deducted our operating expenses, our annual operating expenses. And now I have a net operating income of 12,480. Now my T-bar is complete. So the last step, what's the back fourth line in the T-bar mean? Back fourth line means, yep, I know what you mean. Back fourth line means divide. So you take 12,000 on your calculator, take 12,480 divided by 150,000. And we get a cap rate of 0.0832, or if you want to make it into percent, 8.32%. Make it to percent by moving that decimal over 2 places. Your problem, the 4 answer choices on your test and your practice problems are either going to be rate or percent. So you're either going to be solving for the 0.0832 or the 8.32%. Questions? Look with me, if you will, on page 452. Question comes in, will this be on your North Carolina test? If it's on the syllabus, it's a good candidate for your exam. So could you see this test question? Possibly. So on page 452, we have our income capitalization approach. You see we have our potential gross income, 100% capacity of $60,000. This property has other income sources. It has a vending machine and it has something called a payphone. So the other income sources are $600. So when we add them up, we get total PGI of $60,600. We have an estimated 4% vacancy. So we deduct that to get our EGI of $58,176. Then we tally up, we look at all of our operating expenses. You can see there are some examples, taxes, insurance, heat, maintenance, utilities, decorating, that one makes me laugh. Legal, advertising, management. What you do not see on that list is debt service. Debt service is not included in operating expenses. So we add up all of our operating expenses to get 27,300. Deduct that from our EGI. EGI minus operating expenses gives us our net operating income, 30,876,000. This investor wants a 10% capitalization rate. The question is, what's the value? So you take your net operating income divided by 10% or 0.10. Based on the indicated value using the income capitalization approach, $308,750. So the appraiser is saying, based on your income, based on your expenses, this is what this income producing property is valued at. Questions? Another tool that an investor may use when trying to determine whether or not to purchase this income capitalization or this income producing property. When the investor is trying to determine if this is a good purchase, is this worth my money to buy? They may or may not know the PGI. They may or may not know the vacancy losses. They may or may not know the operating expenses. So the investor may not be able to do the income capitalization approach. But one thing that the investor may do is something called the gross rent multiplier, what I affectionately refer to as the GRM, GRM. And what the GRM does is, for the investor, it relates the sales price to expected rental income. The investor may not know the rent that it's collecting, but the investor can use this with the expected, what they think the rental income. The GRM can be used for 1 to 4 unit properties, income producing properties. And bottom line, for the investor, the GRM determines how long will it take me to get my money back. Isn't that what the investor cares about? Getting their money back. That's why they're an investor, right? They're investing their money. And the question is, how long does it take? So the investor can take the sales price and divide it by the rental income, expected rental income. Typically, if this is a residential rental property, the investor may look at monthly figures. If it's a commercial rental property, the investor may look at annual figures. But bottom line, it's up to the investor. They can study whatever numbers they want to, so they can determine if they're making a good purchase or not. What this tells them, if they calculate monthly rental income, this tells the investor how many months do I have to collect rent to get my money back. If it's annual rental income, the GRM tells the investor how many years do I collect rent before I get my money back. Okay. So let's put our appraiser hat back on one more time, just one more time. So the appraiser, 3 approaches to value that the appraiser may take to determine their opinion of value. Sales comparison approach is best for resale single family homes and land. Cost approach is the best for special use properties. Income capitalization approach is best for properties that produce an income. The appraiser is going to use as many of the three as they can. If they can use all three, great. But they're going to use as many of the three as they can. And once they use as many as the three as they can, then they're going to do a reconciliation. And this is when they analyze and weigh the different approaches, putting the most weight on the type of property that it is. So if they do for a resale single family home, they can do the sales comparison approach. They could do the cost approach, but they're going to put the most weight on the sales comparison approach because it's a resale single family home. It's not a simple averaging. So let's go back, get your magnifying glass out again. And now that we know what we know, let's go back to page 441. And let's look at our sample appraisal again. Again, the black bar down the side tells us the different categories. And if you can't see that, you have those categories blown up for you on page 440. So we start with the subject property, the property that we're identifying, the one that we want to put our opinion of value on. What's the contract information? What's the neighborhood? What are the amenities of the neighborhood? Tell me about the site, the land that it sits on, and all the improvements on the land. It's not just the structure. It might be the detached garage, the fence, the shed, for example. Over on page 442, we use the sales comparison approach. We took our subject property. We found 3 good comps. We adjusted the comps to match the subject. And then at the bottom of 442, you see the appraiser's reconciliation. They have their indicated value by the sales comparison approach. They have their indicated value by the cost approach. And you will note that there is no value by the income approach, which tells me this is a property that doesn't produce an income. If you can't collect rent, you're not collecting rent, you can't use the end. That's why we say they're going to use as many of the 3 as they can. If they can use all 3, great. If not, the very last sentence on page 442, the appraiser, based on their opinion of value, $265,000 as of August 25th. It looks to me like they put more weight on the sales comparison approach, which tells me this is a resale single family. Over on page 443, you can see the breakdown of the cost approach. A little over halfway down there, 443. And then again, you can see the income approach is blank because we don't have an income producing property. What the lender cares about and what you care about when you're working with a buyer. If you see this report, you're going to go straight to page 2 on 442, the very bottom, the reconciliation. The lender will issue the loan based on the sales price or the appraised amount, whichever one is less. The contract on page 441, the contract tells me that the contract price is $263,900. The appraisal is $265,000. The lender will originate their loan based on which one is less. In this case, it will be the contract price. Questions? Back to page, I just want to say one more thing, just kind of a side note, because I always get a lot of questions about this. So let's just go ahead and address it. I don't think you'll be tested on this, but back to page 454. Page 454, it talks about automated valuation models or AVMs. You guys probably know AVMs better as Zestimates. A Zestimate is an automated valuation model, automated valuation method. And what AVMs do They study the subject. So what you're looking at here, my little dot with the radius. They study the subject property. And then they study everything, just say, for example, that closed within a 1/4 mile radius recently, 6 months, for example. And that's all they take into consideration. Was it a condo? Was it a 2-story? Was it a townhome? How many bedrooms did it have? Square feet? How big is the land? AVMs don't take any of that into consideration. All they do is a 1/4 mile radius from 123 Main Street. What all closed in the last 6 months? Based on that, here's our Zestimate. So do your head one way or another. Are Zestimates accurate? Knowing what you know, are they accurate? No. Because there's much more involved than what everything that closed in a 1/4 mile radius. I think I don't know what they do. I don't know their purpose. But that's why we do our CMAs. And guys, the other thing I want to say back to us as brokers for CMAs, CMAs aren't the only piece that we use to help us determine probable sales price when we're trying to work with the seller to help them determine probable sales price. There are other tools, there are other things to look at. This is just getting you guys introduced to this idea. There's more in post licensing. There's more once you get your license and you get out in the real world. I know, for example, another tool that we use is something called absorption rate pricing. And that says, how long did it take everything to close? Did it take everything on average 2 months to close, 6 months to close? And we can use that to help us determine how long to have our listing agreement. So for example, if the average list to close time is 7 months, would you take a listing for 2? No, because again, the numbers tell you it's going to take on average 7 months to close. So I just say all that to say that CMAs aren't the only thing that we use, but it is one of the bigger ones, and it gives us an idea. So what is the difference between the two, the sales price and the appraisal? Again, the lender is going to issue the loan on whichever one is less. So if the appraisal is less than the sales price, then we either need to get the seller to drop the sales price. Is the seller required? Do they have to drop the sales price? No, but as a buyer's agent, you know who I'm calling first? I'm calling the seller to see if they were, or the listing agent to see if they'll reduce the sales price. If the seller's unwilling to reduce the sales price, the buyer has to have that money laying around. They've got to have that extra money. They're not going to be able to get a loan for that amount because they're already getting a loan for the mortgage. So they need to get that money out, go out in their backyard and start digging or wherever they have that cash so they can come up with the difference. If the seller's unwilling to drop the purchase price and the buyer doesn't have any extra money laying around, game over. This is one reason why we really like to have our appraisal back while we're still in due diligence. Because as a buyer's agent, if I have to terminate, as a buyer's agent, the best thing I can do is get my buyer their earnest money deposit back. So while we don't have full loan approval, usually in due diligence, we can get the appraisal back and know that they can afford to buy. Okay. All right, broker hat back on. Let's act like an agent again. We don't act like agents much in this class, do we? So agent hat back on. We talked about our CMAs and our BPOs. So let's talk about how the Real Estate Commission weighs in on our CMAs and BPOs. Article 6 of license law is addressing BPO and CMA. You don't need to know Article 6. I just put it here to let you know that I'm legit. Commission rule is Rule A.0 or A.2200. So what I'm telling you is this is one of few topics that falls under license law and commission rule. Now we're going to talk about license law and commission rule at the very end, but this is one that we see under both law and rule. The commission says, need to be very clear, we do not act as an appraiser. We cannot do a CMA to determine market value. We cannot do a CMA for the purpose of originating a loan. That is the appraiser's job to offer that opinion of value. The Real Estate Commission also says that CMAs, BPOs have to be in writing. What do you guys think? Are you going to keep CMAs and BPOs in your transaction files? Yeah, because what do we document? Everything. So not only does it have to be in writing, but we're going to keep it. Provisional brokers cannot do a BPO for a fee. If you're a third party asks you to do a BPO, provisional broker can do it, but they can't charge a fee. So as a BP, I don't think you should do one because you're not going to get paid for it. Let your BIC or a full broker do it. Once you drop your provisional status, then you can do them for fees. And nobody, I don't care who you are, provisional broker, full broker, or broker in charge, can charge as part of our general brokerage services. So in other words, when you're at your listing appointment and the seller looks at you and says, how much do you think I can get for my home? We cannot look at them and say, I will answer that when you give me $300. We cannot charge to do a BPO or CMA. That's just part of our job when we're working with buyers and sellers, general brokerage services. And again, it's so important that we remember what we do with a BPO and a CMA is determine probable sales price, or in the event of a lease situation, property management, we can talk about probable lease price. So that's a good point. Thank you. Provisional broker can't do anything while your license is inactive. So you can't do nothing until you activate your license. Yep. As a PB, how do you activate your license? You affiliate with a firm. You're under the direct supervision of a broker in charge. We will talk more about that when we get to our license law and commission law. So I'll leave you guys with this in this unit. This is probably one of my favorite. I think it's supposed to be a comic strip. It's like funny but true, one of those things. So this is probably one of my favorite comic strips in real estate. And I think what this reminds us of isn't value in the eye of the beholder. Isn't it in the eye of the beholder? Guys, sellers have a lot more value in their property than buyers do. To the seller, this is their home. This is where they live. Blood, sweat, and tears went into this. The memories, and little Bobby fell over here and scraped his knee one day. And to everybody else, it's just a house. And I think that's one of the I don't want to say challenges, but one of the things that we need to address and be aware of when we're discussing with sellers. When you walk in that door to that listing appointment, they're probably going to have more value than what your CMA says. And this is why it's so important that we learn how to accurately do CMAs so we can show them the numbers, so we can have these discussions and we can bring them back down to maybe the reality of the buyer. And that gets us through unit 17. So we got key terms, the beginning on page 433. Key point review, 457, and then the student quiz. On page 459. Little bit of math that we talked about. Again, the sales comparison approach is considered math, I think just because there's numbers involved. But the math concepts on page 455 goes over the sales comparison approach and the income capitalization approach. Those are the maths you need to worry about. Here are the numbers, those 50 pages in the back of the, or those 50 questions in the back of the book. These are the numbers that relate to the math that we just went over. And then there's some good stuff in the Unit 17 material and Learn, Test, Pass as well, including that sales comparison worksheet that I showed you guys that we talked about. Questions? So let's go ahead and take our break. I know we're a few minutes early, but let's go ahead and take our break. And when we come back, we're going to get into Unit 13. Unit 13, we get to put in our homeowners insurance agent's hat. Homeowners insurance agent. So let's take 10. We come back, Unit 13. We're back. How we doing? We ready to think like an insurance agent? How many hats do brokers get to wear? We need a basic understanding of, so this is why we're here. All right, so let me take attendance. And oops, I forgot how to take attendance. There we go. That's right. What hats do we wear? We kind of wear all of them. All the while staying in our lane. Knowing when to call the lender, knowing when to call the insurance agent. That's what a big part of this class is teaching us whose responsibility is what. And guys, we're the glue that holds this whole thing together. So unit 13 is our property insurance basics. Again, please note the word basic. We'll get through this unit pretty quickly. Just a couple test questions, not many at all. So we'll get through it pretty quickly. Little history on this unit, because I think this is interesting. And I'd like to give you guys a pat on the back. The North Carolina Real Estate Commission's education department has been around for a little over 40 years. The current education department that we know it today. I don't know what it used to look like. But when the education department first created this pre-licensing class, they had an insurance unit. And somewhere in the course of time, they dropped this unit. They said, this isn't important. Brokers don't need to know this. And probably 5 years ago, give or take, they added it back. When I took pre-licensing in 2008, we didn't have this unit. So why am I patting you on the back? Because you guys are starting out the gate with a little better knowledge about, like, for example, property insurance basics that brokers working today don't know. The only reason I know what I know is because I'm here with you guys. And again, just a basic understanding to help, particularly our buyers, some with our sellers through this transaction. All knowing when to know how to have them contact their insurance agent. I wish I would have known this stuff, but now I do, so here we are. So in this unit, we're going to talk about different types of homeowners insurance. We're going to talk about some insurance issues. Again, short and sweet unit. So first, define some words. Can you guys see my page numbers today? Can you guys see them today? So weird. Same PowerPoint as last class. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So on page 352, we're going to define some words. Insurance is the policy. Insurance is the agreement between the two parties. It's the bilateral contract between the homeowner and the insurance company. The insurer is the insurance company. The insurer agrees to reimburse the homeowner in the event something happens. The homeowner then is the one that is insured. They are the ones that are covered under the insurance agent's policy. If a buyer is getting a loan, insurance is required. Period. End of story. A lender will not issue a loan without insurance, homeowner's insurance. If it's a cash buyer, homeowner's insurance is highly recommended. And the premium is the consumer's cost of coverage, the insured's cost of coverage, the homeowner's cost of coverage. Defining some more words. Property insurance, sometimes referred to as casualty insurance. This is what protects the insured by damages caused to their property. Property insurance protects the insured. Liability insurance protects the insured from losses or damages caused to third parties. So if you have somebody else on your property and they injure or they do damage, liability insurance. So then package insurance is combining the two. Package insurance is covering the property and the people, basically the third parties. Just for your information, top of page 353, there's some examples of things that are typically covered. (353) to 354, there's several different policies. There's not just a one size fits all homeowners insurance policy. So again, just kind of FYI, this gives you an idea of the different types of policies out there. The one that we need to know is the HO3. The HO3 is the most common policy. It's the one we see the most often. This is the one that satisfies the lender's criteria. So the lender doesn't say you just get any insurance. The lender does have certain criteria, and HO3 generally satisfies the lender's criteria. Once your buyer goes under contract, yay. So you go under contract, get the contract sent to the lender, get the contract sent to the closing attorney so you can start those balls rolling. Then the lender is going to be in touch with your buyer to get the information they need to send for the first round of underwriting. When you go under contract, tell your buyer that the lender is their priority. As a matter of fact, I actually tell my buyers, you call the lender back before you call me back. Once your buyer gets the lender the first round of information they need, then we need to start getting our buyers shopping for homeowners insurance. And we definitely want to encourage them to shop around, because not all homeowners insurance agents are the same. They're all different. So tell them to talk to 2 or 3. If you know a couple, you can recommend some names. If you don't yet, you will. They like to come by and drop off donuts and that kind of thing. So you'll get to meet a few once you start working with them. But give them a list of 2 or 3 and encourage them to shop around. We want them to have their insurance policy in place and approved by the lender while we're still in due diligence. Because if we find out for whatever reason that homeowners insurance pushes them above their allowable monthly payment, they're not going to get loan approval. And again, I hate to terminate, I really do. But if we have to terminate, the best thing I can do for my buyer is terminate within due diligence. So we want to make sure they secure a policy and the lender approves it while we're still in due diligence, just in case. Another policy is the HO4. This is your renter's insurance. If you're a renter, you have a tenant policy. Tenant policies don't cover the building. Tenant policies cover your stuff. So in the event of a landlord-tenant situation, the landlord, the homeowner, is going to have the structure and the land, the property insured. The tenant is going to have their belongings, their possessions. 2 different policies covering 2 different things. Another one just to mention is the HO6. This is your condo owner's insurance. Condos owner's insurance, or the HO6, is sometimes referred to as a walls in policy, because you'll remember condo owners only own inside. They only own from paint to paint. So they're not going to cover the entire structure, just the personal property, the fixtures, etc. Again, 353, 354, you can look at those there. HO3 is the most common. Did I hear a question and unmute? Or am I hearing things?
Can you go back one slide for a second, please? Thank you.
Defining some other words on page 354. Bottom of page 354. A condition is a limitation on the coverage. There might be a limitation. An example of this is vacant properties. We're going to talk a little bit more about vacant properties in just a second. An endorsement is something, it's coverage for something that's not usually covered. You can add an endorsement to your policy. Maybe you have an antique. Maybe you have, very rare jewelry or something. You may want to get an endorsement on that to cover it. And then an exclusion is loss due to a specific event. For example, most homeowners insurance policies will not cover us in the event of acts of war or terrorism. Those would be excluded. So you're shopping around for homeowners insurance, or you're telling your buyer to shop around for homeowners insurance. And one thing that the homeowners insurance agent is going to do is pull something that's known as the CLUE report. The CLUE report stands for a Comprehensive Loss Underwriting Exchange. And what the CLUE report is, it's a database that collects all claims that the people make, all claims made on the property within the last 7 years. Properties and people that have a lot of claims in their CLUE report may have higher premiums. If you have a history of filing claim after claim after claim after claim, or if the property has a history of having claim after claim after claim filed, the insurance agent may have a higher premium, higher coverage, and that's what the CLUE report gives us, the history. So I said earlier, this unit was here and then it disappeared and then it came back 5 years ago. It's of my opinion. You know what they say about opinions, right? It's of my opinion that the whole reason we got this unit back was to have this discussion about vacant and unoccupied properties. So first off, let's define the difference. A vacant property is one that everyone and everything has moved out. There's no personal belongings, there's no people left. An occupied property, the people may not be there, but the stuff is still there. It looks like somebody can return at any moment. I have an uncle and we call him a snowbird. Do you know why we call him a snowbird? He lives 6 months out of the year in Pennsylvania. He lives 6 months out of the year in Florida. It's a rough retirement life, isn't it? So 6 months every year, he has an unoccupied property. This is the deal, you guys. At some point between now and closing, your seller has to move out. He does. At some point between now and closing, your seller has to move out. Yes? If they're moving out a couple days or a week before closing, probably not a big deal. If they're moving out a month or so, for example, if this property is going to be vacant for a longer period of time, we need to encourage our seller to contact their insurance agent and let them know that the property is going to be vacant. Vacant properties are at higher risk. There's bigger chance for vandalism. There's bigger chance for theft. You guys hear every once in a while somebody breaks in and steals the copper wiring. That probably more apt to happen in a vacant property. If the insurance company doesn't know that the property is vacant and something happens, they may not cover it. So we need to encourage our sellers when they're moving out. Again, if it's the day before closing, I wouldn't worry about it. If it's a couple weeks, I would look at my seller and say, contact your insurance company. They're going to say, well, my premium's going to go up. Yeah, they're going to go up. You're going to have higher coverage during that time. But if you don't, and something happens, insurance isn't going to cover it. Can I make anybody do anything? No. All I can do is recommend to my seller that they call and report it vacant. If I have this conversation face to face or on the phone, am I going to follow it up with an email? You better believe I am. Per our conversation, I suggest you contact your insurance company, because what am I doing? Documenting the fact that I told them, see how I'm trying to protect you here? I think this whole unit was brought back into pre-licensing because of that. I would also encourage them to report if it's unoccupied. I don't know that insurance cares about that. I don't know that their premiums will go up, but let's err on the side of caution here, because you still don't have occupants. And that's what our sellers need to understand. You move out a month before closing, somebody breaks in and steals the copper wire, you are on your own. Questions on that? I don't know about land. I don't know how land works with insurance. We're just referring to the property, the structure. The other thing I think is important, the other reason I should say, why I think we got this unit added back, is because we also need to make sure that our sellers understand that they need to maintain homeowners insurance through closing. Because the risk of loss is still on the seller. Y'all, the seller still owns the home. Even though we're under contract, it's still the seller's property. We're under contract, but whose name is on the deed? It's still the seller's property. I've had numerous sellers over my years. As soon as we go under contract, woohoo, I'm going to cancel my insurance. Whoa, 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 whoa. I know we're trying to save some money here, but whoa. What if something happens when we're under contract? Can the house burn down when we're under contract? Unfortunately, yes. So we need to make sure that our sellers understand that they've got to maintain homeowners insurance. The day of closing, the seller's insurance policy is going to end, the buyer's is going to start. So in a sense, the property is doubly insured on the day of closing, right? One policy ends, another one begins. So the question is, what if the house burns down on the day of closing? It's a bad day. My gut tells me that it's going to come down to the time stamp that the deed was recorded. Who's responsible for it? Because isn't that your proof of ownership? So if the house burns down at 8 a.m., it's still the seller's. If it burns down at 4:59 p.m., the deed's probably changed hands and now it's theirs. So when I say it's doubly insured, don't think that both insurance companies are going to eagerly jump in to take care of it. They're going to want to know whose property was it when it burned down. We remember our contract says, what if, Julie, what if it does burn down while we're under contract? Remember the risk of loss provision in our offer to purchase and contract says that if the house casualty of the property, the buyer has two choices. They can terminate, get their earnest money and due diligence back, or they can proceed to closing, buy the property, and then get the proceeds of the seller's insurance to rebuild. So you're under contract and the house burns down. It ain't over yet. Your buyer has choices. And before your buyer makes those choices, I would make 2 suggestions. I would have them contact their attorney, and I would have them get in touch with the seller's insurance company. And after talking to the 2 of them, your buyer needs to decide, do they terminate, get their earnest money and due diligence back, or they proceed to closing and get the proceeds of the seller's insurance policy? Questions on that? So what's all this mean for us? Well, we need to have the conversation with our sellers. We're encouraging our buyers to shop for homeowners insurance as soon after we go into contract as they can. With the sellers, we need to have conversations, make sure that they know that they need to maintain coverage through the day of closing. And also encourage them to report it when the home becomes vacant or unoccupied. And let me help you document that conversation. Because if you don't tell them that and something happens, who do you think they're going to call first? CYA, y'all. This is our 3rd CYA. We've caught our accountant, we've caught our attorney. Now we are covering your assets. See what I did there? Cover your behind, y'all. Document, document, document. There you go. Cover your arrears. I love that. Thank you. Oh, I just got a new thing for my next class. Cover your arrears. Where's your arrear? All right, over on page 357, we talk about different forms of possession. Now we've talked, possession happens when the new deed changes hands, right? It's not a done deal until the buyer's new deed is recorded. The parties may agree to different possessions. The parties may agree to do a buyer possession before closing. They could also agree to do a seller possession after closing. Now I have forms for both of these. We're not going to look at them, but we do have addenda for each. They're in Learn, Test, Pass if you want to look at them. They're not meant to serve as leases, but they do cover the basis for a short-term possession. In either case, one party is acting as the homeowner, the landlord. The other party is acting as the tenant. Buyer possession before closing means the buyer's moving in before they own the property. Seller still owns it. They're the landlord. Buyer's living there. They're going to act as the tenant. The buyer's going to pay rent. That rent's negotiable. Seller possession after closing means closing has happened. The deed has changed hands. The buyer is now the owner, but the seller's going to remain as a tenant. Anything is negotiable. I will say this. Either one of these situations can be risky. Proceed with caution. Have your buyer and or seller talk to their insurance agent, possibly their attorney if they have a bunch of questions. And make sure you look over those addenda and understand them before you have them signed. But if they agree to it, as we've been saying, the parties can agree to do whatever they want to. If they want to do a buyer possession before or a seller possession after, somebody's going to have homeowners insurance, somebody's going to have renters insurance. Another big thing that may come up dealing with insurance is flood insurance. If the property's in a flood zone, the lender may require flood insurance. I'm here to tell you guys, flood insurance is not cheap. Again, if we can't afford homeowners insurance and flood insurance, if it's not within our approval amount, we want to know before, while we're still in due diligence. So if we have to terminate, I can get my buyer their earnest money back. So FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, is who regulates flood insurance. And they just don't regulate insurance. They try to reduce flooding in an area that's prone to it. Insurance agents, this is one thing that is a one size fits all. Insurance agents don't determine flood insurance. Insurance agents determine homeowners insurance. But if the property's in a flood zone, then FEMA or the flood insurance is going to determine what that cost is going to be. And if you will, real quick, look with me at the top of page 358. And how they determine how much flood insurance is going to be is like this algorithm. They're going to look at the year the building was constructed, the building occupancy, number of floors, locations, flood risk, and then any deductible coverage. So all this is like beep, boop, boop, put in the system, and then it spits out the amount for flood insurance. So again, I think it's important, while we encourage them to shop around for homeowners insurance, and the homeowners insurance agent does provide flood insurance, but the homeowners insurance agent doesn't get to decide how much flood insurance is. It's determined through FEMA, through this algorithm. Good news for us is this is math that we don't have to do. So again, these designated flood zones, this is what FEMA has decided are flood zones. And what they're saying is that the land is just subject to flooding. We know what happens when we get these big heavy rains come in fast, like in the spring, like streams become creeks, creeks become rivers, rivers become these big gushing bodies of water that are going to do and go wherever they want to. It's hard to stop water, isn't it? Water pretty much does what water wants to do. So these areas that are prone to flooding, either with lots of rain or fast, hard rain, FEMA is going to define as a flood zone. After class, please don't do it now, but after class, if you really want to, you can go to FEMA and there's a map. And you can put in an address, pull up the map, and it'll tell you if an area is in a flood zone or not. I always try to look at the FEMA map before I write up an offer. Because if we're going to deal with flood insurance or possibly deal with flood insurance, I want my buyer to know going into it. It looks to me, understanding I'm not an insurance agent or I'm not FEMA, but it looks to me that your property might be in a flood zone, which means you may be required to pay flood insurance. And guys, again, if my buyer's about maxed out to their allowable amount, their allowable monthly payment, if flood insurance is enough to tip them over the top, we're not going to get loan approval. So I like to try to look at these things before we go under contract. So this is Winston-Salem. And as a matter of fact, this map makes me a little sad. If we were face to face, we would be here. So to get your bearings, this is Stratford Road right here, and here's Knollwood. Here's Thruway Shopping Center. I know everybody knows this. Chick-fil-A is like right there. Everybody with me? So to get your bearings. Then we have, you guys see 421 right here, now known as Salem Parkway today. And then across from 421 is a residential area. And there's a creek that runs back there. And these properties, doesn't look like there's anything, but this is our flood zone. So if I was writing a buyer up in this area, you guys see this? I would probably throw up a little flag that says you may be subject to a flood zone. Again, understanding I'm not an insurance agent. I'm not FEMA. I'm not a surveyor. I'm just looking at a map and telling you what I see. Flood zones are known what's in a 100-year floodplain. And this is a very misleading name. I don't know why they call it this. This does not mean that this area has a chance of flooding every 100 years. What the 100-year floodplain says is that it has a 1% annual chance of flooding. So if it's in a 100-year floodplain, that means there's a 1% chance it's going to flood this year. Flood maps change. If we have years with exceptionally large amounts of rain, we may have areas that are now a flood zone that weren't. So 100-year floodplain, all it's saying is there's a 1% chance that it could flood. This could flood this year. All right, so let's bring this home. What's this mean for us? We need to be on the lookout for signs of possible flood zones. Remember your little red flag? If you're showing property and there's a creek or a stream or a river nearby the property, your little red flag should go up to encourage your buyer to investigate, to encourage your buyer if the seller tells you that their property is in a flood zone and they pay flood insurance, if the seller's got to pay flood insurance, we know the buyer will have to as well. Listing agents, that's a question we need to ask our sellers. Are you in a flood zone? Do you pay flood insurance? And if so, that's a material fact that we have to disclose. Just because the land may be in a flood zone doesn't necessarily mean that the property is. For example, I had a listing several years ago, and it was like this really weird shape, something, I don't know, kind of sort of like that. And it was 5 acres. And at the top of the acres, there was a creek. Let's pretend that that's a creek. And the home that I listed in the property was like right here. So the home was right at the edge of the property, and it had, 4.25 acres behind it. Yes, the property is in a flood zone, but the structure wasn't. Does that make sense? So just because you see, 5 acres is a lot. So that was and I got a lot of questions from a lot of phone calls from good buyer's agents. I see a portion of this property is in a flood zone. Do your sellers have to pay flood insurance? It's part of our listing agreement. Our listing agreement helps us remember all the things we have to ask the seller. So we can use that as a tool going in. You'll probably generate, a checklist as you go, as you learn. Take your checklist with you to make sure you cover all this stuff. There's a lot we got to ask sellers, yes, before we list their home. And flood insurance is another one. Also for us listing agents, again, we need to discuss with our sellers. Tell them they've got to keep their homeowner's insurance policy through closing. If closing gets delayed, they need to extend their policy for a couple more days or however long the delay is. Buyer's agents, we need to encourage our buyer to shop around and secure flood insurance while we're in due diligence. If they can't afford homeowners insurance, they're not going to get loan approval. And give them choices. Once you start meeting vendors, working with them, never look at a buyer and say, this is the homeowner's insurance agent you're going to use. Give them choices. Tell them to call Jake from State Farm. Tell them to call Flo from Progressive. Tell them to shop around and talk to several different companies. Do we like Unit 13? We tend to like Unit, no? Short, sweet, to the point. So you got those key terms on page 351. Key point review, 359. Student quiz 361. Please don't spend all your study time on unit 13. I did not say, don't look at unit 13. I said, don't spend all of your study time. You can expect 1 or 2 test questions. Questions? Okay. Everybody good? Anybody not have this? Everybody good? I need to stop sharing just for 1 second, so bear with me. We are getting out of this PowerPoint. Maybe. And we are moving on to unit 11. So if y'all want to start finding page 309. Unit 11. Unit 11 is switching gears again, just a little bit. The big portion of this class, the big focus of this class has been residential sales. However, part of real estate is also the lease side, the landlord and the tenant. So what we're going to do in unit 11 is define the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. Maybe there's a real estate agent involved, maybe there's not. This is just the landlord who's the owner of the property, and the tenant is the person that's allowed to live there. Unit 12 brings in the real estate agent. Unit 12 is the property management. Anybody thinking about or going into property management? A couple of you? Good. We need you. We need you. Majority of people go into residential sales, which is fine, but we also need some more good property managers out there too. So definitely a need for property management. So in unit 11, again, defining the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. So in this unit, we're going to explain the 4 different types of something called a leasehold estate. So we'll define a leasehold estate and talk about the types. We're going to identify the basic characteristics of a general lease. And we're going to describe the different types of leases and their purposes. Again, this is one of these things. Landlord and tenant can agree to whatever they want to, right? So we're not going to do the, well, can they do this? Can they? Sure, as long as they agree to it and it's legal, no problem. So this is why we're just kind of a basic getting us started. And the first thing we need to do on page 310 is define some words. The lease is the bilateral contract between the landlord and the tenant. Both parties have duties and obligations to each other that we will talk about. The lessor is the giver of the lease, also known as the landlord. The lessee is the receivee of the lease, also known as the tenant. The lease is the agreement between the lessor and the lessee. The lease is a contract. So you remember basic contract law that we talked about back in Unit 9? That applies to our lease as well. So let's go back in time for a minute. You guys remember long time ago in Unit 2, and we introduced you to estates. In one word, who can remind me in a chat what an estate is? One word. One word. What is an estate? An estate is the interest that one holds in a property. So for our purposes, we have two interests. Either you own it or you possess it. So in Unit 2, we talked about freehold estates. It's an estate of ownership. Now we're here talking about leasehold estates, which are estates of possession. The tenant doesn't own anything, but they have the right to be there. Remember that, our bundle of legal rights? In a leasehold estate, the owner has unbundled their rights. They've given some of their twigs to the tenant and allowed them to possess their property. They have the right to be there. So we have a couple different types of estates. You see them down here at the bottom. We're going to talk about each of these. Before I do, I always forget, there's an off-book slide. I always forget about this. Just real quick, a couple terms about leasehold and freehold estates. You got two different things going on in a leasehold estate. Somebody owns it, somebody has a freehold interest, somebody else possesses it. So you got two different things going on, freehold and leasehold. So when it comes to these, something called privity of estate, that's just the legal relationship between the two, between the leasehold and the freehold, the landlord and the tenant. Privity of contract just says contracts are only binding on the parties to the contract. So for example, our lease is only binding to landlord and tenant. So the big picture of this slide says, I got two different things going on in a lease situation. Somebody owns it, they have rights. Somebody else lives there, they have rights. So now we can go back to the book and we can talk about the different types of estates. In your book on the top of page 311, it breaks down what we're getting ready to talk about, the four different types. I like the breakdown to help simplify things a little bit for us. And as we talk about the different types of estates, leasehold estates, it's important that we understand what distinguishes the four of them is how they end. So what differentiates, what makes these four different is how they end. So the first type of estate that we have is an estate for years, also known as a tenancy for years. One of these things, they like to have several different words that mean the same thing. And with an estate for years, there's a specific beginning date and there's a specific ending date. And when it's over, it's over. Can we agree to extend it? Of course we can. There is no notice has to be given. We've already decided, we agreed when this thing was going to end. We don't have to give notice. It's an automatic termination. And when it's over, it's over. I need you guys to listen to me for a second because this is important. The name estate for years is very misleading. Estate for years, maybe it's for a year, maybe it's for 2 years. An estate for years could be for a month. It could be for a week. It could be for a day. What makes it an estate for years? Because we have a specific beginning date and we have a specific ending date. And when it's over, it's over. Another type of leasehold estate is called a periodic tenancy, also known as a tenancy from period to period. With a periodic tenancy, there's a beginning, the specific beginning, but there is no specific end. We have to end it, either the landlord or the tenant. It automatically renews. It automatically keeps going until one of us puts an end to it. It's not uncommon for an estate for years to turn into a periodic tenancy. So let's say you're going to rent my house. And we agree in the lease to do a year. We're going to start today, and we're going to go for a year from now. At the end of the year, if we have a good relationship, I provide you fit and habitable conditions, which we'll talk about. And in exchange, you pay me every month. We're happy at the end of the year. We can agree to keep going. We may not need to enter into another estate for years. We can agree to keep going in a periodic tenancy until one of us ends it. There are criteria for how much notice we have to give each other, whoever's going to end it. We do have to give notice. And if you'll look with me further down, page 311, the bullet points there. If it's a week-to-week tenancy and we're ready to end it, whomever's going to end it has to give 2 days notice. A month to month, we have to have 7 days notice. Year to year, we have to have 1 month. I see this all the time in MLS, all the time. Home is currently occupied by a tenant. Tenant requires a 30-day notice. What kind of lease are they on? Periodic tenancy. The third type of leasehold estate we have is an estate at will, also known as a tenancy at will. With the estate at will, the tenant is there because the landlord allows them to be there. I don't have an official lease. I don't have an automatic renewal. I don't have a termination date. No prior notice is required. I don't have to give you 30 days notice on an estate for will. When I want to end it, I end it. When the landlord wants to end it, they end it. There's no required notice. That's the difference in an estate at will and a periodic tenancy. Periodic tenancy, we got to give each other notice. Estate at will, we're done. The only reason the tenant is there is because they have permission to be there by the landlord. The example in the book kind of makes me chuckle a little bit on page 312. The end of a lease period, a landlord informs a tenant that in a few months, the city is going to demolish the apartment building to make way for an expressway. The landlord gives the tenant the option to occupy until demolition. But guess what? When they show up with a wrecking ball, you got to go. The estate at will is over. They have permission to be there. Don't have to give each other notice. The fourth estate we have is called an estate at sufferance or a tenancy at sufferance. And in this case, somebody is suffering. Who's suffering? The landlord. Because they got a tenant that isn't paying, but they're still living there. I want you guys to write something down for me. If you pay, you stay. If you stay, you pay. As long as the tenant is paying and the landlord is accepting, we have a periodic tenancy or an estate at will. An estate at sufferance only shows up when the tenant is there, but they're not paying. If you pay, you stay. If you stay, you gotta pay. We will talk in just a bit about how a landlord can get rid of a squatter. Again, typically the way this happens, anything's possible, but typically the way this happens is we did have a lease. Maybe we had an estate for years and it ran out, and at the end of the lease, the tenant doesn't leave. That's what we mean by holdover. Both parties have rights, tenant and landlord. And again, in just a bit, we will talk about the things that the landlord can do to get that squatter off their property. It's not as easy as what you may think. We will talk about that. Questions so far? Let's go and take our last break before we start a new section. So let's say 10. We come back, we keep going in unit 11. Welcome back. How we doing? So far, so good? Good. So let me see you back. Take attendance. Oh, Holly, I think I just got you, but let me do that again just to be sure. You're good. Yep, doubly good now. Okay. Any questions on the leasehold estates? Again, we talked about freehold estates back in unit 2. Now we're talking about leasehold estates. Welcome back. And thank you for telling me you're back. So now we're going to switch over to the different types of leases. We talked about a leasehold estate. So now let's talk about the different types of leases. And I'm at the top of page 313. Again, a nice little handy dandy chart there to help us summarize all of these types of leases together. And the types of leases in general tend to be a problem topic. Again, one of these things, you guys, we just need a very basic understanding of, but we do need to have a basic understanding of it. So please make sure you're looking at that types of leases, that chart there on page 313. You know, you're not going to get a full-blown question, but it might say, this is the scenario. What type of lease is it? So this is where we need that very basic understanding. And what differentiates these is how rent gets paid. The type of lease determines how the landlord gets paid, how and when possibly the landlord gets paid. So the first one we have is something called a fixed rental. May also be referred to as a gross lease. This is our example of a residential lease. Please understand, landlord and tenant can agree to whatever they want to. But for our purposes, typically where we see a fixed lease is our example of a residential. And what this lease says is the tenant pays the rent, but they don't specifically or directly pay any of the property charges. So the tenant pays the landlord pays the bills. Do you think the property bills are rolled into the lease? Do you think the landlord takes that into consideration when they're charging rent? Absolutely. So the tenant, in a sense, is paying for these, but they're not directly paying for it. Tenant pays the landlord pays the property bills. And that's a very common example of how a residential lease works. The rest of these that we're going to talk about are various ways that we see in commercial properties. This is probably our biggest commercial section in this class. You'll get more commercial when you go to post licensing, by the way. Anybody heading towards commercial? Anybody? A few of you? Good, good. We'll see, maybe. We'll see you in post licensing. And as with anything else, I don't care what you're doing, residential sales, property management, commercial, makes no difference to me. You always need more training. So the rest of these we typically see in commercial. And the first one we have is something called a percentage lease. And in a percentage lease, the tenant pays a base rent plus a percentage of their gross or net income. So they have a flat amount every month that they pay. The best example of a percentage lease I can give you is a mall. Y'all remember when malls were fun? So in the mall, the tenant may have a base rent based on their square footage. How much space are they occupying? We remember Belk is much bigger than Claire's, right? So Belk is going to have a higher base rent because they occupy more square footage. Claire's will also, but it's not going to be near as much. In addition to that base, the tenant's also going to pay a percentage of their gross or net income, whatever the parties agree. We're going to look at an example together in just a second. The reason this one is a red star is because we're gonna look at a math example. I'm not sure that you'll see the math, but we're gonna have an understanding of how this works. So we're gonna look at an example together. So based on the tenant square footage, the mall charges a base rent of $1,300 per month. Where do we get that 1,300? Because it's how much square footage of the mall they're occupying. In addition, the terms of the lease state that the tenant will pay 5% of gross sales on any annual amount over $160,000. Last year's sales were $250,000. What is the tenant's total annual rent for this year? So the first thing we're going to focus on is just the base rent. Every single month, this tenant owes $1,300. There are 12 months in a year. So their base rent this year is going to be $15,600. They have to pay that no matter if they make money or not. That's their base rent. Any questions on that? The second piece is the percentage. So the problem says that they agree to pay 5% of gross sales on any annual amount over 160. So if your sales last year were $159,999, all you'd have to pay is the base rent. You only have to pay that percentage when you have sales over that 160. Everybody good with me so far? So the lease says our sales last year were $250,000. So what is that amount over? What is the difference? The amount over is $90,000. 160 is the minimum. I had sales at 250, which means I had $90,000 over 160. Lease says I'm going to pay 5% on that amount over. So my 90,000 times 5% is 4,500. So I have my base rent of 15,600. I have my percentage, which means my total rent for this year is going to be $20,100. What I owe you monthly, take that and divide by 12. Is this amount going to change next year? Is this amount going to change? If my sales change, I mean, is there a good chance I'm going to have more or less than 250? I mean, what are the chances I'm going to have 250 again, right on the butt? You guys with me? So it's one of these things that we want to reevaluate every year. Yes, the tenant will probably have to turn their books over to the landlord to verify that 250. You think the landlord's going to believe the tenant when they say, oh yeah, my sales were 250? No, the landlord's not going to believe them. So they're going to have to show them whether or not they do gross or net is agreement between the landlord and the tenant. Questions on the percentage lease? Another type of lease we may see in commercial is something called a net lease. In a net lease, the tenant pays rent. And in addition to that, they pay all the property charges. So the tenant pays the landlord and they pay taxes, insurance, utilities. The tenant does all that directly. So tenant pays rent plus all or some of the property charges. What are those property charges? Completely negotiable between landlord and tenant. Takes the landlord, they don't have to play middleman now. A graduated lease says that rent increases at predetermined times. Your rent's going to be X amount year one, it's going to go up year two, it's going to go up year three. We're going to increase your rent at a predetermined time. I think a good example of a graduated lease is that for a startup business, a startup company. You're not making any money today. Today's day one of your business. Hopefully next year you're making a little bit more. Year two, you're making a little bit more than that. Bless you. My goodness. Year three, you're making a little bit more than that. So we agree when we enter into the lease, landlord and tenant, this is your rent today. At this date, it increases to X amount. At this date, it increases again. Graduated lease. An indexed lease says that rent increases or decreases throughout the tenancy based on some agreed upon index. An example of an index that's commonly used is the government's cost of living index. When the government's cost of living index goes up, guess what happens to your rent? It goes up. When the government's cost of living index goes down, good news for you, so does your rent. It can go up and it can go down. We're going to decide in advance what type of index we want to use. And that's how we know rent adjusts. There's something called a ground lease. First off, let me say this because you guys tend to get upset when we talk about this. Ground leases tend to be for long periods of time. Think, for example, 99 years. That's a long, long time. And how a ground lease works. The tenant rents the land and then the tenant builds on it. The only rent that the tenant is paying is for the land. They build the structure. See why we have a 99 year, for example? I've always heard this is how Walmart operates. Say what you want to about Walmart, but think about it. They are geniuses. They own the land. They charge the Walmart franchisees rent on the land. The franchisees has to build a Walmart. And once they're up and running, the franchisee sends them a percentage of their sale. Brilliant. Why do we not think about that? Verizon cell phone towers may work this way. For example, Sprint, T-Mobile, whomever. They're renting the land from you, but they build their tower. They pay you rent for the land. It's brilliant. I wish I had a chunk of land. Well, one, I wish I had a chunk of land, but two, I wish I had a chunk of land that Verizon wanted to put a tower on. They call that mailbox money. Y'all know what mailbox money is? You walk out to your mailbox and there's money. Mailbox money. It's that easy.
They get to write that off. They get to write
heck yeah.
everything there. So
Heck yeah.
it just makes everybody happy.
I wish I had land, and I wish I had land that Verizon wanted. Or Walmart. Oh my God, that'd be so much better if I had a piece of land that Walmart wanted. So let's see. So if you purchase the land, you don't pay anything for the property. You build the property. You're just renting the dirt. You build the property. But you pay rent for the land. The last one we're going to talk about is the full service lease. This is where you have a multi-tenant building and they share in operating expenses. Think of an office park, for example. Part of your monthly rent goes toward, maybe we only have one janitorial crew for the whole building. So part of your rent goes towards paying that janitorial expense. If the building's big enough, it might have one maintenance person, excuse me, one maintenance person. That's a full service lease. Questions on our types of leases. Again, when you're sorting through these, ask yourself, how does rent get paid? What happens to that rent that gets paid? And that's what distinguishes between these.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On page 313, where it gives the types of leases that are there,
Mhm.
how come like the oil and mineral lease and the full service lease aren't under that
Aren't what?
box? They're not under that box.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay,
The ones we talked about are the ones in the syllabus. Okay. All right, 315, we're going to talk about the essential elements of a valid lease. Guys, remember, a lease is a contract, so basic contract law applies. I hope this list looks familiar to you. Remember seeing this back in Unit 9 when we talked about the essential elements of a valid contract? When we talk about the essential elements of anything, the validity of anything, what we're saying is, how is the judge going to interpret this? So if the judge gets the lease in their hands, the question is the judge going to determine it valid? And what the judge is looking for, do we have mutual assent? Do we have that meeting of the minds? Did the landlord and the tenant agree to come together and enter into the lease? We got to agree on rent, security deposit that we'll talk about. So we have our meeting of the minds, mutual agreement. Any legally binding contract has got to have some form of consideration. In the case of a lease, that consideration is rent. In exchange for you living on my property, this is how much I expect to collect. Both parties have to have capacity to contract. And then you cannot have a legally binding contract for an illegal purpose. So we have to have legality of objects. We have to have legal terms. Starting on page 315, we're going to talk about some other common provisions that may be found in a lease. Again, you guys, please understand, it's completely negotiable between the party. So we're going to talk about some common provisions that we may see. Page 315, the tenant's use of the premise. How the tenant uses the space. Is it residential? Is it commercial? The landlord needs to make sure that the tenant is following zoning, restrictive covenants, bylaws. So for the landlord, it's important that they know how the tenant plans to use the space. Commercial retail, for example, back to Thruway Shopping Center, there may, and again, this is just an example, there may be an exclusivity. There may be a provision in that lease, for example, that says you can only have one restaurant that serves pizza in Thruway Shopping Center. So what's that? Bricks Pizza is already there. So can Pizza Hut go to Thruway? Can they open up a store in Thruway? Their use would be excluded because we already have a place that serves pizza. So to the landlord, it's absolutely important that they know how the tenant's going to use the property. Thanks, Julie. Now we want Oreos and pizza, right? Sorry about that. The landlord needs to make sure that the tenant, particularly in commercial, is abiding by any environmental. Remember, our environmental unit was unit 20. So the landlord, I'm sorry, the tenant doesn't need to be, every once in a while you hear on the news about a restaurant that got caught dumping their grease in the creek out back. That would be an environmental concern. And when that happens, y'all, they're not calling the tenant, are they? Who are they calling? The landlord, the owner. Industrial leases, they deal with a lot more chemicals and equipments and stuff like that. So they may be dealing more with environmental concerns. The landlord is liable because they're still the owner of record. So the landlord may want to make sure. Any fixtures on the property? I remember back in unit 2, we talked about trade fixtures. Trade fixtures were kind of our exception a little bit, weren't they? And what trade fixtures says is that the tenant can install fixtures to conduct their trade, to conduct their business. And at the end of the lease, they can take those fixtures with them. So again, if it's commercial, there's going to be provision about the fixtures. In a non-residential lease, in a commercial lease, whether or not the landlord is going to make repairs has to be spelled out in the lease. Landlord is not required to make repairs in non-residential. They are required to do certain things in residential, and I'm getting there, bear with me, we will talk about that. But for non-residential, if the landlord's going to do any repairs, we need to spell that out in our lease. Also in non-residential, particularly commercial, there may be an upfitting improvement. Commercial units usually start from the studs. And it's not uncommon from a tenant to go in and like make it their own, create their own space. They can upfit the space to accommodate for their business. And the landlord may have a certain allowance built into the lease. I'll upfit up to X amount. If you go over X amount, that's on you. So upfitting improvements, making the space, customizing the space, if you will, to fit the tenant's needs, commercial tenant's needs. Leases may have an assignment. Remember, with an assignment, all the terms stay the same. The only thing that changes is the name of one of the parties. So whether or not you can assign your lease to somebody else has to be spelled out in the lease. Sublease is similar, but in a sublease, the original tenant still has an interest. So in other words, if new tenant doesn't pay, the landlord can go after original tenant. They could still be liable. And then with them retaining this reversionary interest, if new tenant wants out, it can reverse back to old tenant. Yeah, hey,
Is there a way to make the person that subleases responsible?
for everything,
Yeah.
call it an assignment.
Oh, okay.
Yep, and that's exactly what the difference is. Assignment, I say, here you go, Jeff. With a sublease, I say, here you kind of go. I'm going to give you some, I'm going to keep some. So if I want you to have it all, I'm going to give you an assignment versus a sublease. Thank you. Over on page 317, term and renewal. How long is the lease? And do we allow for automatic renewal? Again, this is going to come back to the type of lease. In the state for years. I mean, the type of estate, excuse me. State for years, periodic tenancy. Tennessee it will. We're in a state of sufferance. So term and renewal, when does it start? We always have to have a definite start date. When is it going to end? How is it going to end? Do we allow for automatic renewal? Any legally binding contract is going to have some kind of default. Like what happens if one of us has to take each other to court? It's not uncommon for contracts just in general to have something in there that says we're going to try to hash it out over mediation. Nobody really likes to go to court. So maybe we go through mediation. What's the default? What's our legal remedies? Leases may have an option to purchase or a right of first refusal. Remember, we talked about these at the end of Unit 10. Does the tenant have the option to purchase the property? Do they have the first right of refusal, which says if the landlord decides to sell, they have to go to their tenant first? Jeff, is that a new hand or was that the, is that a, do you have a quick, no?
Sorry, I forgot.
Okay, no, I just want to make sure. Y'all don't let me not catch you. Thank you. Landlord's right to enter. Unless stipulated in the lease, how much right do you think the landlord has to enter the property that they own? Unless stipulated, how much right do they have? 0. If the landlord wants the right to enter the premises, they got to put something in the lease. If you want to go change the furnace filter, you need to give them 24-hour notice, for example. Case of emergency, of course. The reason for this is because the tenant has the right to quiet enjoyment. Part of those twigs that the landlord gave the tenant was that you don't have to worry about interference from anybody, including the owner of the property. The tenant has the right to live there without being pestered, if you will, by the landlord. So it's not uncommon, particularly in a residential lease, that says the landlord, if they want to walk in the front door, they got to give notice. How much notice? We're going to agree to that in the lease. Questions on these common provisions may be found in a lease. Over on page 318, we talk about how leases generally end, termination of lease. Mutual agreement, the parties agree to enter into the lease. The parties can agree to get out of the lease. In the case of an estate for years, once we hit the expiration date, when it's over, it's over. Operation of law. If the court takes the property, if the judge takes the property, it's no longer the landlord's to rent. The tenant does have a few rights in this case. Mostly got to give them some notice. But maybe the landlord loses the property to eminent domain, for example. Maybe the landlord loses it to foreclosure. And there's some risks involved, yes. How do you as a tenant know that your landlord's going to pay their mortgage every month and not go into foreclosure? But operation of law, once the judge takes the property, it's no longer the landlord's to rent. And then if one party fails to perform their obligations, we're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a minute. But for a residential lease, it's pretty simple. For a residential lease, the landlord has to provide fit and habitable conditions in exchange for rent. So if the tenant doesn't pay, or if the landlord fails to provide fit and habitable conditions, that may terminate the lease. Again, we're talking more about that in just 1 second. Please bear with me. All right, private chat time. Tell me in a private chat, what is the law that requires certain documents to be recorded to be enforceable against third parties? Certain documents are required to be recorded to be enforceable. No question marks. Afterthought. So we talked about two different laws that we like to mix up, don't we? Statute of frauds and the Connor Act. Both apply to leases. Statute of fraud says it has to be in writing and signed to be enforceable. Connor says it has to be recorded. This is what we need to understand about leases. What do the statute of fraud and Connor say about leases? Any lease more than 3 years is required to be in writing and signed and recorded. Now let's break this down. First off, more than 3 years means if you have a lease for 3 years, statute of frauds and Connor don't require it to be in writing. They don't require it to be recorded. 3 years and 1 day, now it's required to be in writing, and now it's required to be recorded. Everybody with me so far? More than 3 years. Is it just good practice to put all leases in writing? Even if you have a lease for a day, isn't it suggested to get it in writing? Sure, why wouldn't we, Julie? I need you guys to hear what I'm saying. Your test is not going to ask you what you're going to do. Your test is going to ask you what the statute of frauds says you have to do. Per the statute of frauds, if you have a lease for a week, do you have to get it in writing? No, y'all, please do not get in your own way. Are you gonna? Of course you guys, because I've already taught you to document everything. But your test isn't going to ask you what Julie said. Your test is going to ask you what the statute of fraud says. Statute of fraud says anything more than 3 years has to be in writing and signed. Connor Act says anything more than 3 years has to be recorded. So what we're going to do now, starting on page 319, we're going to talk about something called the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. This is the act that drives the landlord-tenant relationship. This is state specific. So North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act could be a good candidate for your state section. And the Residential Rental Agreement Act tells us a couple of different things. Its purpose is to ensure that tenants have habitable units. Guys, in a residential situation, that is the landlord's #1 responsibility, is to provide fit and habitable conditions. The landlord providing fit and habitable conditions in exchange for rent are mutually dependent, which means if one party doesn't perform, then the other party doesn't have to either. So if the landlord stops providing fit and habitable conditions, the tenant doesn't have to stay. We'll talk more about that in a second. Under the Residential Rental Agreement Act, the landlord cannot, under any circumstances, waive their duties to provide fit and habitable conditions. They cannot say, well, in exchange for rent, why don't you fix the roof? Does this happen in the real world all the time? And don't send me rent this month. You just take care of that. Does it happen in the real world? Sure. What do we know about the real world versus pre-licensing world? Not always the same thing. So in the pre-licensing world, the landlord cannot waive or alter their duties to provide fit and habitable conditions. The Residential Rental Agreement Act, I guess big picture, is meant to protect the tenant from the slumlord landlord. And it saddens me to say, but the majority of our tenants out there don't know their rights. They don't know what their right is if they don't have these fit and habitable conditions. So the act is here to protect the tenant if the tenant knows about it. Despite the name of the building, if it is considered a residential rental lease, the landlord can't alter their duties. If it fits under this category, the landlord has that duties. What's that old saying? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's probably a Residential Rental Agreement Act fit and habitable condition duty. So let's look at an example together. There's a building called the Downtown Hotel, and it's the primary residence of many occupants. Some occupants live in the building for long periods of time. Each unit has a living area and a kitchen. The occupants are residential tenants that are protected by the act, despite the fact that it's called a hotel. So just because you call it a hotel, for example, doesn't mean you can get away with providing fit and habitable conditions. Hotels and motels in general are not residential, right? They're going to be considered commercial. So again, we're meant to protect the landlord, I'm sorry, the tenant. Landlord's biggest obligation, provide fit and habitable conditions. It's that simple. Here's another example. The landlord rents a deteriorating home to a tenant under a lease that provides. Tenant is hereby agrees to accept the leased home as is. Landlord is not responsible for the condition of the heating unit, wiring, or plumbing. Tenant agrees to be solely responsible for the ability of the leased property. Yeah, that's not going to stand up in a court of law, is it? Because the landlord can't ever waive their duties of providing fit and habitable conditions. Just because they put it in the lease, and the unknowing, uneducated on this matter tenant isn't aware of it. Does this make sense? And this is what makes me sad, because this is where I fear some landlords take advantage of their tenants, banking on them not knowing that this is not an enforceable contract, an enforceable lease. What happens if they don't provide fit and habitable conditions? I'm getting there. Bear with me. Again, you guys, every once in a while you see on the news, I think the most recent story I heard was maybe a year or two ago, an apartment building downtown Greensboro. You guys remember this? And these poor tenants, I mean, they had mold, they had water damage, they had critters running around and scurrying around, and they had all sorts of things going on, and the landlord wasn't doing anything. Is mold and rats and insects providing fit and habitable conditions? Those poor people. And not knowing what else to do because they were fighting an uphill battle with their landlord. I'm very proud of them. They went to 2 wants to know. They made it a point of going to the news. And of course, the news said the landlord wouldn't respond. Well, duh, you know, they're not going to respond to that. But the landlord has this duty. A question comes in about working AC. Remember when we talked about measuring residential square foot? We said the only requirement was heat. AC is considered a luxury. I know you wouldn't agree with me in July and August, but AC is considered a luxury. It's not required. Somebody says you think there should be a mandatory disclosure. I cannot agree with you more. However, here's the problem, you guys. Landlords don't have to be licensed. If you're leasing property that you own, you don't have to have real estate license. So there's no way to mandate that. There's no way to control that. And that's why we have something like the act to help protect the tenants. And unfortunately, they don't get that protection until it goes down. So under the act, there's some duties of the landlord. Again, fit and habitable conditions. The landlord needs to make sure that they comply with current building and housing codes. They need to make all necessary repairs to keep and maintain habitable conditions, habitable premises. If there's a common area, if it's like an apartment building and there's like a parking lot and a breezeway and maybe a little playground, the common area is the responsibility of the landlord, keeping that safe and maintained. The landlord in a residential lease, what we're talking about, the landlord needs to provide working smoke detectors and possibly carbon monoxide detectors if applicable at the beginning of the lease. So at the beginning of the lease, they got to be working. Throughout the tenancy, the tenant is responsible for changing the batteries. When y'all set your clocks back, I don't do it myself, but when y'all set your, no, when you fall back this weekend, remember, isn't that what they say? When you change your clocks, change the batteries in your smoke detectors. I know, me neither. I need to practice what I preach. Make yourself a note. I will too. I bet, Alondra, I just saw that. That makes me nervous. My pre-licensing instructor said, just make sure I would start with your lease. I would start with your lease, see if your lease mentions anything. And I don't know, because remember, refrigerator isn't considered a fixture. I don't know if, honestly, I don't know if a lease is any different or not. So or they beep you to death. That's right. Isn't that annoying? Beep, beep. You change the batteries, you get your broomstick after it. I'm not sure which one, but one of the two will shut it up. Not advised. Not advised. So what if the landlord fails to provide fit and habitable conditions? You guys all please remember, if you stay, you pay. If you pay, you stay. But what if the landlord fails to provide fit and habitable conditions? The tenant's eviction remedy is known as constructive eviction, which means the tenant can move out and terminate their lease early. So after making numerous requests and given the landlord a reasonable amount of time to make the repairs, if those requests go ignored, if the landlord is not, after a reasonable amount of time, getting somebody out to make a repair, the tenant's eviction remedy is, in a sense, to evict themselves. They move out because the landlord didn't do what they were supposed to. The tenant isn't expected to maintain their end of the deal. If the tenant doesn't move out, they still have to pay, because if you stay, you pay. So let's say we have a, well, I got an example. We'll look at an example together. So constructive eviction, the tenant is evicting themselves. So let's say a tenant leases a home for a 2-year lease. Several months into the lease, the roof develops a major leak. In spite of numerous complaints, the landlord makes no effort to repair the roof and even tried to put the roof maintenance responsibility on the tenant. The tenant vacates the home and rents somewhere else. Even though the lease still had time, the tenant is relieved from further liability because the landlord's inaction constitutes constructive eviction. So again, let's make sure we're all clear. This does not say the tenant calls the landlord and says, my roof is leaking, fix it. And it's not fixed tomorrow, so the tenant can move out. Does that give the landlord enough time? Is that reasonable to expect the landlord to run over today and fix the roof? I mean, what if we had a major storm? Y'all notice our major storms, we start seeing lots of tarps on roofs. Lots of roofs get damaged after major storms. And our roofing companies are busy. So, you know, if the landlord can call and get in line and get the roofer scheduled, I mean, that's pretty much what they can do, right? Maybe they bring a tarp over, maybe they bring buckets over to collect water. I mean, there's a difference in making an effort and doing absolutely nothing at all. And what this constructive eviction says, if the landlord ignores your requests, if they don't make any kind of effort, if we're waiting on the roofing guy to come on Friday, there's only so much we can do. Does that make sense to you guys? Communication is key, not just in the tenant landlord relationship, but any of our relationships in life. Communication is key. In this case, numerous complaints. Again, something else I fear that a lot of people, particularly tenants, don't know. Should the tenant document the numbers of times that they tried to contact the landlord? Should they have a text and a phone call and an email, and should they document those conversations? Unfortunately, not all tenants may know that. That's their leg to stand on if this ever goes to court. I called you on this day, I texted you on that day, da 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 da. So when I say document everything, I'm not just talking about your real estate career. When I say document everything, I'm telling y'all to document everything. The second piece of this is that the landlord made no effort. They ignored the call, they swiped to delete, right? They made no effort. So because of these two things, the tenant, they move out, they don't have to pay. Oh, let's see. How would the tenant get the deposit if the landlord tries to use to terminate the lease? Would the tenant need to give a notice? They did give a notice when they said, my roof is leaking, come fix it. Don't forget about me. Let me send you a text. I'll call you again, da 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 da. They did give notice. Unfortunately, if the landlord's not willing to give their deposit back, we may have to go hash this out in mediation, take it to court, whatever. Remember what we said on day one, you guys. If two parties can't agree to agree, then a judge will decide for them. And I think landlord tenants, especially in a case like this, that's what a slumlord does. They bank on their tenant not knowing their rights, right? That's how they get away, because they bank on the tenant not knowing. And that's what makes me sad. I think we need better protection for tenants, better way to somehow educate tenants.
Honestly, it's kind of like they're protecting the landlord in the sense
Okay.
that if they don't provide a fit and habitable place, then nothing happens. But just
Exactly. It's not a problem until it's a problem, and then it's a problem, right? So maybe that one unsuspecting landlord gets the tenant that knows what they're doing. Maybe they took Julie's class and they know what they're doing, and they now know what to Google North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act to learn about their rights. So just by saying there's a leak means notice for leaving. I didn't say one time. We said numerous. There's a leak, there's a leak, there's a leak, there's a leak, right? Again, you can't say my roof leaks, I'm moving out, right? We got to have, there's got to be a reasonable understanding. The other thing in dealing with the landlord has to abide by something called the common law of negligence. Anything with common areas, the landlord's responsible for keeping those common areas safe and maintained. So again, think of an apartment building. There's a parking lot, there's a breezeway, there's a playground, maybe there's a clubhouse, a gym, a pool. Any of those common areas falls under the common law of negligence. It doesn't apply to the dwelling itself, the inside of the unit, just the common areas. The landlord's responsible. many years ago, when I was living at the condo, I was taking night classes at UNCG. And I was getting home sometimes, 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, which isn't crazy late, but it's dark out, right? And they were redoing the vinyl siding on our buildings. So they were like taking down the old and putting up new. And when they did my building that day, they did something with the electrical. And when I got home at 10 o'clock that night, I didn't have a single exterior light on my building. I didn't know how dark that building could be until I saw all those exterior lights out. And I had to go, upstairs to the very back of the breezeway. It's not like my building was in front, my unit was front. I made it, it was all good. But that could have been, if something happened to me, that could have been a case for a common law of negligence because the landlord neglected to provide that safe area for the common. Now I called the next morning, and y'all know when I got home from class that next night, we had lights because I feel like the landlord understood, or the property manager understood, this common law of negligence. They are responsible for that. Safety procedures. So that's the landlord side of it. Again, biggest responsibility is providing fit and habitable conditions. What's the tenant's responsibilities? Well, they got to maintain the unit while they're living there. They shouldn't trash it. The landlord could have rights if they do. So they need to keep the inside clean and safe. As we said, the tenants are going to be the one to change the batteries unless agreed otherwise in the lease. Maybe that's one way the landlord can put their eyes on the inside twice a year. Maybe they put something in there that says, I'll come over and change the batteries twice a year. Am I interested in changing the batteries, or do I want to see the condition of the unit that I'm letting you write? So maybe we can, anything's negotiable, but unless agreed otherwise, the tenant's going to change the batteries. I mean, obviously the tenant's biggest responsibility is to pay. They pay rent every month. What if the tenant fails to pay rent? What if the tenant fails to maintain the unit, to keep the unit safe? The landlord has one legal eviction remedy. And I'm stressing the word legal because we all have a story in the real world. Let's bring it into pre-licensing right now. The landlord has one legal remedy, and that's called summary ejectment. If the landlord wants to remove the tenant or the squatter, the landlord's only legal remedy is to go to court and have the judge remove the tenant. It is illegal for the landlord to do self-help eviction. What is self-help eviction? You can't go and change the locks. You can't take the tenant's personal belongings and move them on the front yard. You can't show up on the property with the shotgun and say, get off my property. This is why I stress legal eviction remedy is summary ejectment. Do we all have stories of other things happening otherwise? Yeah. Does that mean they're okay? Not according to the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act, and particularly your test. The other thing not allowed is something called retaliatory eviction. The landlord can't evict the tenant for requesting repairs. They can't evict the tenant for exercising their legal rights as tenants. So in other words, if they want to call 2 wants to know, the landlord can't evict them for exercising their rights. If they want to talk to an attorney, the landlord can't evict. They can't retaliate against them and evict them for trying to exercise the rights that they have as a tenant. Just to point out in your book, page 322, we talked about the housing market crash, 08, 09, something like that. Prior to the housing market crash, in the event of foreclosure, there was nothing to protect the tenant. And in the housing market crash, we had lots of foreclosures. And unfortunately, what was happening was tenants were coming home from work saying, this property's been taken by the court and you no longer have the right to live here. And tenants were like, because you got think about it, you guys, is the landlord calling the tenant saying, hey, by the by, I'm behind on my payments and I might be facing foreclosure soon. So the tenant has no idea that this is going on. So as of 2009, there are some protections out there for the tenant in the event that the landlord loses the property to foreclosure. Again, I don't think you'll be tested on that, but that's just an FYI. Questions? Residential Rental Agreement Act. Let me rephrase that. North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. Could be a good candidate for state-specific questions. Could the person renting the property buy it for being foreclosed? Sure. Show up at the auction, has some cash, bid away. Again, once the landlord loses it to the bank, they're not going to have control over what happens. Okay. Well, guys, I think we're going to call it here today just because I don't want to start something new and then not be able to finish it. So please don't go anywhere just yet. Hold up. Let's say goodbye to each other officially. So when we come back together next week on Tuesday, we're going to finish Unit 11. We're pretty close. We don't have much more to say in Unit 11. Then we get into property management. So the Residential Rental Agreement Act, maybe an agent's involved, maybe that there's not. It doesn't matter. When we talk about the Tenant Security Deposit Act, maybe an agent's involved, maybe they're not. It does not matter. This is the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. Unit 12 brings the agent in. What happens when we do have an agent involved in that situation? So we'll finish up 11. It won't take us long. And then we'll do Unit 12. And then we do Unit 19. I always ask you guys to look ahead, but particularly please look at Unit 19. 19 is our fair housing unit. Fair housing, understanding fair housing is not only important for your exam, but it's also important for your career. So I ask you to look ahead. We'll talk about Unit 19, fair housing. After that, we do 18, we do 16, and then we jump into license law and commission rule. The end is in sight, you guys. So please bear with me. Please look ahead. I hope everybody has a great weekend. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me if I can answer questions. I'm around all weekend. So please just shoot me a message. Screenshots help. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see everybody on Tuesday.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
Have a good
Yeah.
day.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for your
you.
time, Julie.